is leading and commit ourselves to following in this way. Our charism of discernment is for the church. We will need to play a critical role in helping our church become a synodal church, a church that listens and listens to everyone. In this way, we will serve as prophets who witness to and help realize what God is working. I pledge the resources of Mwangaza to the support of our symposium. Let me or Sister Josephine at reception or any of our staff know how we can contribute further. In welcoming us all, I close in affirming that our task is not only daunting, but also so exciting. We are here to share what we are living and to progress in utilizing the exercises more aptly to support the people we help form and serve here in Africa, and to follow Jesus, Mwangaza, the shining light, in establishing the reign of God more firmly in our midst. Thank you. I now want to welcome Father Jose Minaku, the Society of Jesus, President of JCAM. I only welcomed you. He's opening the symposium. Karibu.
Thank you. Yeah. Good morning. Dear participants and friends in the Lord, Bishop Rodrigo, with deep joy and gratitude, I stand before you. Actually, I'm sitting. To officially open this important symposium dedicated to the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius in the African context. We gather here in this peaceful and wonderful, prayerful environment of Mwangaza under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, who continues to lead the church on the path of synodality. We come not merely as scholars or religious professionals, but as seekers and co-pilgrims on a shared journey of discernment. The word of the psalmist resonates in my heart. I quote, "You have made known to me the path of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence." Psalm 16. May our time together help us better discern the path of life as it takes root in African soil, African hearts, and African histories. After expressing my gratitude to God, the giver of all blessings, I sincerely thank Father General Arturo Sosa, whose generous supports and encouragements made this initiative possible. His trust in the significance of this gathering reflects the Society's strong commitment to the universal apostolic preferences, especially the call to lead others to God through the spiritual exercises and discernment. I also sincerely thank the member of the Roman Curia, Father Fraten Massawe, whose absence due to health we genuinely feel, and Fathers James Anve, Chukuyenu Mafiore, and Feston Kenda, whose theological insight and a Roman perspective continue to enrich our shared mission. Their steadfast dedication to the global society, especially to the African Church, commands our respect and gratitude. I sincerely thank Father Jean-Luc Enyenge, Director of the Jesuit Historical Institute, and Joseph Mboya, who just completed his doctorate in Pontifical Gregorian University, whose visionary spirit, intellectual depth, and spiritual insight have greatly enriched the conception and the planning of this symposium. Their contributions show both scholarly rigor and pastoral sensitivity. I also truly appreciate Ms. Ella Mwinja and Mr. Geoffrey Obata for their tireless effort in supporting this initiative. Your dedication and behind-the-scene commitment have been vital. I warmly thank the Africama team, especially Father John the Baptist Zamcho, Ms. Sharon Oduor, Ms. Anastasia Makudu, whose quiet dedication and steadfast support have been essential in making this gathering possible. Thank you to you, Father Terry Charlton, for your word of welcome, which beautifully reflects the typical Kenyan hospitality of Mwangaza Spiritual Center. Finally, to all of you, some of whom have traveled to great distances, I extend a warm welcome and heartfelt thanks, especially those who will serve on panels and join us with insight and spiritual depth. As we begin this gathering, the city of Nairobi is experiencing unrest. While strongly condemning all violences, we must acknowledge the ongoing struggle for greater distributive justice and the reaffirmation of human dignity. In my address, I would like to briefly explore the deep spiritual hunger in Africa today before turning to the spiritual exercises themselves. Indeed, before talking about the spiritual exercises, let's talk about spirituality in Africa and Madagascar. This initial reflection will help me highlight the essential connection between spirituality and the real-life experiences of our people, a connection that must become the core framework in which the spiritual exercises are rooted if they are to make a meaningful impact within the society today. Let me illustrate with an anecdote. In 1994, a conference on prayer and human development in Africa was held at the Catholic University in Kinshasa. One session had the striking title, Africa, You Need a Mysticism. At that time, some, including myself, might have thought it was too much or even more provocative. However, its prophetic significance was hard to ignore later on. The author of this paper, the late Father Dirven, philosopher and epistemologist, clearly articulated the issue. He believed that the deep crisis facing African society are not merely political or economic, but spiritual. Colonization, slavery, and cultural domination not only destroyed institutions, but also shattered the spirit of our people, disconnecting them from their ancestral roots. This spiritual disorientation or inner division is not just a thing of the past, but an ongoing existential struggle. In the Ignatian tradition, it is especially true such dislocation in the wounds and the contradiction of life that God chooses to meet us. Further divine insight echoes a pressing paradox highlighted recently in JCAM Review, issue 70. Madam Marcel didn't pay me to advertise for that review today. I quote, this is the call for articles. I quote, African authors like Umelo, Biko, or John Beatty strongly argue that religion is intrinsic to the African existential fabric. If the former insisted that every human being, African, has a spiritual essence, the latter maintained that Africans are notoriously religious. However, despite Africa's religious prevalence, many Africans paradoxically grapple with persistent, multifaceted crises in the form of social, economic, ecological, and political upheavals. End quote. We thus face a spiritual tension. Does our religiosity translate into moral coherence and social transformation? Africa is both deeply religious and deeply wounded. This tension calls for clarity. What do we mean by religious person? Is it mere piety or a withdrawal from the world? Or it can be, as in the African tradition, a wellspring of resistance, resilience, and renewal. Some thinkers, including the Congolese theologian Kamana, 1954 to 2021, offer a critical diagnosis. In his work, Changer la société and la reconstruction de l'Afrique, Kamana describes what he calls spiritual illness, marked by a loss of self-confidence, disillusionment about the future, and inability to love oneself. This illness impacts not only individuals, but entire communities. Those of us serving in the pastoral setting, sometimes they come across with this kind of observations, I quote. Our family father is cursed by ancestors. I am haunted in dreams by a night husband and a night wife. God no longer blesses me despite my offerings. Those are kind of things we hear on a pastoral setting. Such expressions, although sometimes tinged with fear, reveal a deep longing for meaning and healing. They should not be dismissed or treated as pathology, but understood as cries of the soul seeking salvation. Herein lies a key opportunity for the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. They cannot remain abstract or Eurocentric. If they are to take root in Africa, they must become credible tools of healing and freedom, addressing the real concerns of African hearts. Kamana, on his side, proposes a form of African spirituality therapy, which includes a rereading of history to transform human trauma into prophecy, a rediscovery of dignity rooted in the imago Dei, image of God, a spirituality of responsibility among all, and a Christianity neither westernized nor magical, but incarnate, engaged, and liberating. This essential approach highlights the importance of a spirituality that reinterprets the Word of God through the lens of African people's spiritual wounds. Spirituality then becomes a vital path to the full liberation of the human person. Therefore, organizing a symposium like this is a true opportunity, a kairos, a favorable moment in and for African life. This is the moment for spirituality. This dynamic is well illustrated in Father Orobator's book entitled Theology Brewed in African Pot, 2008. While the book provides a speculative theological discussion, it can also be seen as a spiritual text, as it guides theological reflection toward a lived experience of God within the African context. This view supports a theology that is rooted, incarnational, and transformative. Several aspects of the book justify viewing it as a form of spiritual meditation and clarify how spirituality becomes the ultimate horizon of African theology. From the very beginning, Father Orobator states that African theology is fundamentally about life. It is not just abstract speculation, but a reflection rooted in the real experiences of African people: suffering, joy, family, community, rite of passage, celebration, etc. The book also portrays a faith that is deeply embedded in African cultures. This reflects an authentic effort of inculturation, viewed not just as an adaptation, but as spiritual understanding, recognizing the seeds of the Word of God within African cultures, and the Holy Spirit at work in traditional rites, proverbs, and ancestral stories. The book affirms a theology that becomes prayer, fire, and a way of life, a theology that breathes. Such an approach reminds us that in Africa, theology and spirituality are not separate disciplines, but two sides of the same search for meaning. So what is spirituality? It is about restoring humanity's breath. The Latin root of spirituality is spirare, meaning to breathe. It shows that spirituality isn't just a decorative. It is essential. It is the breath that gives life. In the African worldview, the sacred is not divided into parts. It exists in the soul, in music, in tears, in song. Spirituality should therefore be expressed and serve as a source of new life in a suffocating situation. Finally, let's come back to the spiritual exercises themselves. I'll just stress 2 points and there. First, the spiritual exercises are not unfamiliar to Africa. They fulfill Africa's desire for peace, justice, identity, and wholeness. They guide us from illusion to truth, from fear to trust, from fragmentation to unity. They teach that freedom is not the absence of suffering, but the presence of grace. As David Fleming, SJ, affirms, they help us become the person God created us to be. Second point, the discernment of spirits. as Father Charlton mentioned it. The discernment of spirit, a key Ignatian tool, is especially helpful in our context. It enables people to recognize God's voice amid confusion, fear, or cultural ambiguity. It sheds light on inner darkness and provides a path to peace and growth. The spiritual exercises can thus help us to hear the Spirit in our own languages and rhythm, to integrate ancestral wisdom with the gospel of Christ, and to affirm the presence of grace even in wounded histories. As the Ethiopian proverb says, where water begins to spring forth, there life also begins. The exercises are that spring, quiet, steady, and life-giving. I conclude, dear friends in Christ, this symposium is more than just an academic. It's an academic exercise. It's a sacred space for listening to the Spirit, to one another, and to Africa's wounded yet resilient soul. Let us approach these days as we will enter a retreat with open hearts, humble spirits, and the courage to be guided by others. May the same Spirit who overshadowed Mary in her fiat, inspired St. Ignatius along the Cardinal River, and healed St. Josephine Bakita's deep wounds, may that Spirit guide us toward greater freedom, deeper discernment, and a more generous mission. In the spirit of collaboration, may we journey far with God, for Africa, and for the Church. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, Jose, for opening the symposium. My task is simple, just to explain how we shall be proceeding these days with our symposium. So each morning we will have a keynote address that will be followed by a question and answer session. And after the keynote address, we will have 3 people. On Tuesday, we'll have 4 presenting on various themes of Ignatian spirituality, the spiritual exercises in the African context. And so the 3 people, after they present, we will also have a question and answer session. In the afternoons, we will have focus groups. And so in these focus groups, what I'll invite everyone participating here is to select where you'd like to be. So for example, today we shall have a focus group guided by the Jesuit Historical Institute in Africa. So here we shall be discussing and engaging each other on the importance of keeping records and what do we have that we can conserve that will be used not only for ourselves but for future generations. And then we will have another focus group led by Zaidi Center for Ignatian Spirituality. And here it will be discussions around how Ignatian spirituality can reach people in a pastoral sense. So for example, their work with parishes, with schools, with universities, and others. And then we will have the Jesuit Institute of South Africa leading another focus group. So there are many of us here who work in centers of Ignatian spirituality that have the aspects of formation, but also of dissemination of the spiritual exercises. And so this group will lead us in such a discussion. So I invite everyone present here to choose one of these focus groups and engage from your experience
and from your background, where you come from. This will be the same for tomorrow and then on Wednesday, and when the time comes, I will explain about that. So we'll pass around a sheet of paper and you will go filling your name. Not necessarily where you are an expert, but where you feel you can contribute or where you need to gain some more knowledge and experience with a small group of people. So the first group will meet in this hall at 2:30 after lunch. And then this group is led by Filippo Pio of Jesuit Historical Institute in Africa. Where is Philip? You can stand so that they see you. So Philip will lead the group in this hall. And then the second group will be led by Celine Akwiri. Celine. So Celine will be in the hall that is across directly from the office of Sister Josephine. Or if you are entering Manresa House, this on your left, there's a hall. And then the third group by the Jesuit Institute in South Africa will be led by Ms. Puleng Matsaneng. So Puleng's group will be at the offices of the directors of Mwangaza. As you go down to the chapel, you will see the building on your left. And there in room 10, they will have their focus group. But in case of any clarification, you are always welcome to ask us. So at this point, I would like to invite and welcome our keynote speaker for this morning. Our keynote speaker for this morning needs no introduction, Father Roberto Agbonkianmege. He is the Dean of the welcome, Father Roberto. Yes. He's the Dean of the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley, California. He has been the former president of the Jesuits of Africa and Madagascar and former provincial of Jesuits of Eastern Africa Province, and also former principal and former rector at Hekima College. He is a renowned author of many books and many articles, and indeed an authority on many theological aspects. He is also in the team of the Synod for Africa, constituted by Pope Francis. And so, Father Roberto, welcome, and we expect to draw from your wisdom. Thank you.
Father Jose Minaku just told us that we're in a sacred space. This is a sacred space. So I'll just invite us to just pause for a moment, and as he said, to breathe, or let the Spirit breathe in us. Let's just pause for a moment and let the Spirit breathe in us. And let's also acknowledge the Spirit that breathes in our colleagues, our friends who are present with us here and online as well. Let's acknowledge the Spirit that breathes in them. Ba 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 Owasenagbokan Babarieti wayama Nagbo yayayi Uogwimaro Baba 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 Abuyirao Owasenagbokan Babarieti wayama Nagmo yayayi Uogwimaro Baba. This international symposium to explore the spiritual exercises in the African context is overdue, innovative, and as Father Terry Charlton said, exciting. And credit for this pioneering initiative must go, first of all, to Father Joseph Mboya, to Father Jean-Luc Eyegwe and his wonderful team at the Jesuit Historical Institute, and to Father Jose Minaku, the president of the Jesuit Conference of Africa and Madagascar. I know particularly that Joseph has had this idea for a long time, and thanks to your tenacity, your perseverance, and just deep faith in the importance of this tool, this gift that we celebrate, the spiritual exercises, we're all gathered here today. Thank you very much. Thank you. I, for one, do not have any particular expertise in the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola. Outside of the mandatory twice in a lifetime 30-day retreat, the annual retreat, and the occasional invitation to lead Ignatian spiritual exercises, my knowledge and understanding of the spiritual exercises is just basic. But to the best of my knowledge, the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola has been translated into a few African languages. Some of us may be familiar with this. I think, for example, of the Swahili translation, Mazoezi ya Kiroho ya Mtakatifu Ignatius wa Loyola, which was translated in 2005. And on the authority of Father Festum Kenda, who I believe is in the room, on the authority of Father Festum Kenda, thank you, quote, before this translation, there were 2 earlier unpublished attempts in Kiswahili, which survive only in the AOR archives, end quote. Then there's the Malagasy version, which is in Malagasy called Fampiensam Panahi. Then there's the Kenya-Rwanda version, Imyitozo ya Roho, which was translated by Father Martin Mudendeli in 2020. There may be other surviving translations, and when I inquired about them, my inquiry didn't bear fruit. I remember asking a colleague, a Jesuit colleague in Southern Africa, whether there was any local translation of the spiritual exercises, and his response was, quote, we came across one in Shona. Let me check with Father T, end quote. Then I inquired about the same in Central Africa, and I got this response from a Jesuit colleague, quote, Father Matungulu did translate the spiritual exercises in Lingala. I wonder if we still have a copy in our archives. As for Kikongo, I have no idea. I will inquire, but I don't think there is any, end quote. Now, quite clearly, my conclusion from this inquiry is that there are no versions of the spiritual exercises that are rooted in the lived realities of the continent. Now, my observation is neither a critique Certainly neither a critique, nor should it cause desolation. Actually, I consider this gap an opportunity. As we just heard this morning, a kairos moment for all of us. Now, I have not read any of these translations, but my guess is that they are literal, and they are based on existing translations, either in English or in French. In fact, mazoezi, mitozo, vampiensam, I'm told, literally mean physical exercises. Physical exercises. Or physical training. It is conceivable that the translators may have applied or been guided by the principle of functional equivalence. But they are translations nonetheless. Whether literal, formal, or functional, these translations, I would guess, are basic text. They are not critical text, and that's not the purpose of the translators. Now, given the richness of African spirituality, the depth of our symbolic universe, as Father Minaku just pointed out, and the diversity of its vibrant cultural worldview, I believe that this symposium offers us the opportunity, an exciting opportunity, for rethinking, for reimagining, for reclaiming the abundant gift of the spiritual exercises in the African context. So for this initial reflection, I would like to propose for your consideration 3 points. 3 points. The first point is what I call vernacularization, from the word vernacular. Vernacularization. I can safely assume that most of the participants in this room have made the spiritual exercises in one form or the other. And perhaps not in the language of your birth. The exercises may seem alien in English, French, or Portuguese, but when they are conveyed in paradigms, symbolisms, or figures of speech native to us, there is the possibility of making the experience without creating a dichotomy between a purely Western approach or an approach that is grounded in African spirituality. As I see it, the spiritual exercises is a translatable spiritual patrimony. A translatable spiritual patrimony. When I talk about translation, I'm borrowing this term from an African scholar, the Gambian scholar of world Christianity, Lamine Sané, who talks about translatability. And he devoted a lot of his life and research towards understanding what he called translatability or vernacularization of Christianity in Africa. For Sané, this process of translatability or vernacularization was the catalyst for the emergence of indigenous, independent, biblically rooted African churches and communities. According to Sané, unlike Islam, Christianity is translatable. Translatable in diverse cultural and religious contexts while still retaining its core essence. So the flexibility, adaptability, or translatability of Christianity, he said, is actually a strength. It is the strength which guarantees that it has remained a global or world religion. It means translatability means that Christianity is not averse to or opposed to the contributions of the cultures that it encounters. Christianity does not seek to impose its unique framework on them. Now, as Sané explains it, to vernacularize an experience is not simply to pronounce something in one's mother tongue. Rather, it is the creative capacity, as Father Minaku just told us, it is the creative capacity to imagine, to adapt, and live that reality in one's own particular context. So you see, for example, when I call God in my mother tongue, when I call God Osanobua, Akbama, Udazi, Ekwabono, I'm not simply translating from another language. No, it's a distinctive and richly contextual spiritual reality and experience for me. That's vernacularization. Now, similar to this idea of translatability or vernacularization, our Jesuit colleague here, Jean-Luc Enyegwe, he proposes the idea of narrativity from the word narrative or narration. In his thought-provoking essay titled Spiritual Direction in an African Context, which appeared in a Brazilian journal in 2021, Enyegwe wrote, quote, "Narrativity is the key to communicating in Africa." Communicating in African context. The narrative approach has the advantage of finding its raison d'être in the spiritual exercises and the autobiography of St. Ignatius of Loyola. As Africans, embracing narrativity, they tend to write biographies and autobiographies, end quote. And so he continues, to do the spiritual exercises in an African context is to adopt a language, narrativity, and a method, and the lived experience which narrativity implies. This language, depending on context, can be technical, the language of the initiated, of proverbs. It can also be language of the street or of the market, end of quote. To vernacularize is to engage in a creative process. While being faithful to the reality conveyed in the original linguistic medium, this process goes beyond and allows for a unique experience, in our case, of the divine. In a way, vernacularization allows us as Africans to greet and worship God in our possessed chanting, in our multitude of names, and in different ways that can distinguish and identify our approach to God, to the divine, as uniquely African. One of the most interesting things I find about this idea of translatability is that it implies the possibility of actually bypassing linguistic mediations of the text itself in order to draw directly from the sources. In the case of the spiritual exercises, I think vernacularization or translatability would offer this distinctive ability to actually leapfrog centuries of translations in order to create a new text with fresh perspectives, rich experiences, and culturally relevant readings to the African context. But let me clarify one point. By insisting on this dimension of language, vernacularization or translatability, I am not making a plea based on political considerations. And we all know, in general, language is a source of tension and division in Africa because it is political. A few weeks ago, we lost a titan of modern African literature, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Besides his undisputed prowess, literary prowess that is, Ngugi was known for his radical literary conversion from writing in English to writing in his mother tongue, Kikuyu. For Ngugi, his unrelenting advocacy for literature written in African languages was an attempt, as he put it, at decolonizing the African mind. Now, I am not interested in the politics and ideology of language. That's not my point. What I'm advocating for is for scholars, African scholars, Jesuits, and collaborators to engage in the hard work of probing the sources and creating new renditions and readings of the rich legacies of Ignatian spirituality, of which the spiritual exercises is, I believe, the finest specimen. I said vernacularization allows us direct access to the sources. So let me go to my second consideration, which is precisely the sources, drawing from the sources. Since the publication of the first editions of the spiritual exercises, there's been an incredibly prolific process of probing its sources to produce even more accurate, updated, and modern or contemporary versions of the exercises. The bulk of this work of probing the sources was undertaken by experts and dedicated research centers, such as the renowned Institute of Jesuit Sources in St. Louis, Missouri. When it was founded in 1961, the aim of the Institute of Jesuit Sources was to preserve, expand, and make accessible key texts and studies in Jesuit history. To produce key texts in Jesuit history, spirituality, and pedagogy for scholars worldwide. The Institute published English translations of primary Jesuit sources to ensure broader accessibility, monographs exploring Jesuit contributions and intellectual traditions, and complementary literature supporting Jesuit studies. At its peak, the impressive volumes produced by the Institute established it as an essential resource for researchers, educators, and institutions engaged in Jesuit scholarship. The spiritual exercises in its printed form dates back several centuries to the time of Ignatius. We know that. Some people, I believe, at this symposium have had the privilege of seeing, maybe even touching, the autographed copy of St. Ignatius of Loyola, dating back perhaps to 1544, and several other early translations and editions of the exercises. With the help of experts, philologists, linguists, historians, and experts in Ignatian sources, several critical editions have been published. According to one plausible estimate worked out in 1948, by then, the exercises had been published either alone or with commentaries 4,500 times, an average of once a month for 4 centuries. And the number of copies printed was around 4.5 million. That estimate was made 80 years ago. It takes a particular kind of expertise to access the original or to access these original or source materials. But even more, to render them accessible and usable in contemporary context. I believe that a few participants at this symposium, I will not mention names, some participants at this symposium possess the necessary expertise to undertake this task. The aim of such a task will be, first, to express accurately Ignatius's ideas. Second, to reproduce the thought of the original as modern language speakers would be likely to express it. And third, to adapt the original to the thought patterns of modern users in such a way that a reader today can grasp the thought more accurately with reasonable ease, usually at the first reading. My hope is that a renewed and sustained interest in this kind of work will be one of the fruits or outcomes of this gathering. If I insist on this point of probing the sources, it is because I believe there is a clear difference between me, who simply gives the exercises, and someone else, like several in this room, who possess the competence to undertake the arduous task of developing the knowledge, the understanding, and the practice of the spiritual exercises from the sources. Both are important, but the latter, I believe, are rare in Africa. So now to my third and final consideration or point. And this one I call contextualization. African spirituality, as Father Jose just reminded us, is a very practical kind of spirituality. In this spirituality, experience is more important than theory. Some of us are familiar with the work of George Gans. George Gans, who translated several of the sources into English. He observed that Ignatius of Loyola, quote, made the exercises before he wrote them, end quote. He made the exercises before he wrote them. If we are able to vernacularize the spiritual exercises by drawing from the original sources or critical source materials, we will be better positioned to contextualize them. To contextualize a literary material requires creative imagination, or in our case, it requires a contemplative imagination. It is not enough to translate. Contextualization implies rendering a material relevant to the context of the contemporary communities and users. Rendering a material relevant. Let me go back to Jean-Luc Eyegwe. In his article, he challenges spiritual directors to imagine an African adaptation of Ignatius's method of the spiritual exercises. This adaptation is necessary, it is possible. As Eyegwe puts it, quote, Ignatius's flexibility allows certain adaptations on the method of the spiritual exercises, end quote. Imagine, says Eyegwe, how Ignatius of Loyola, quote, would have directed a retreat to, say, let's say, the Negus or the king of Ethiopia, end quote. Imagine how Ignatius would have directed a retreat to the king of Ethiopia. Furthermore, Eyegwe continues, quote, if the spiritual exercises should penetrate all aspects of our lives and missions in Africa, the diversity of the same require that the spiritual exercises be adapted, end quote. Let me just digress a bit. I'll digress a bit. On November 1st, 2023, Pope Francis wrote a brief letter at Theologium Promovendum on promoting theology. In that letter, the late Pope of blessed memory issued an invitation for theologians to undertake what he called a paradigm shift, a courageous cultural revolution towards becoming a fundamentally contextual theology. By culturally contextualized theology, Pope Francis meant a theology that is not detached from communities and context of its practitioners. A kind of theology practiced by theologians, if you will, who smell of the joys and hopes, the pain and anguish of the people of their times and contexts. Pope Francis suggested that such a theology requires authenticity, audacity, creativity, and charity that enables the discipline theology to touch, he said, to touch everyone's heart. What is my point? Could we imagine a contextualized reading and rendering of the spiritual exercises that touches everyone's heart in the African context? Could we begin to imagine that, what that would look like? And mind you, God touching a person's heart with mercy and love and compassion, that's the goal and purpose of the spiritual exercises. When Father General Arturo Sosa promulgated the Universal Apostolic Preferences in 2019, he wrote this about the spiritual exercises, quote, "The spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola are a privileged instrument for making the life and action of the Lord Jesus present in the diverse social context of today's world. Discernment and the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius show the way to God." End quote. In a fascinating essay published in the journal The Way in 2014, Nigerian Jesuit Chikere Ogwuanyi argued that the geographical, spiritual, and religious space of Africa, quote, has a uniqueness which makes it a very particular space for affecting the dynamism of the spiritual exercises, end quote. And let me share a thought about a familiar example of what I'm calling contextualization of the spiritual exercises. It is a book by David Fleming, which I'm sure many of us are familiar with, titled "Draw Me Into Your Friendship: The Spiritual Exercises, a literal translation and a contemporary translation." One of the unique things about Fleming's version of the exercises is that it demonstrates how you can translate a text in the sense of vernacularization to make it speak to the experience and context of the modern day users while preserving the historical flavor and the freshness of the text itself. Fleming explained his process. He said, quote, "Draw Me Into Your Friendship represents my attempt to find a way of reading that easily allows us to enter into the Ignatian text and let God take over," end quote. Interestingly, the publishers of his book had this to say, quote, "Spiritual classics are not meant to be rewritten or tampered with. They are not meant to be rewritten or tampered with. But the original text of Ignatius presents difficulties. Difficulties in expression, difficulties in imagery, difficulties in worldview. The present volume is not a commentary on or a substitute for the original. It is instead a way of reading the author's own text, which can draw a person back into the original source," end quote. So what I'm calling contextualization has practical implications and advantages. To quote a colleague of mine, Jim Martin, it provides a means to, quote, "appropriate, deepen, and explain some concepts that might prove difficult for the modern retreatant without sacrificing any of Ignatius's intent, end quote. And Fleming explains further, saying, contextualization requires a considerable amount of creativity. It allows us, quote, to give new shape to the expressions, the choice of words, the image language, its subtle nuances, its consistency, and the way it provides for relationships, end quote. So you see, contextualization is a useful principle for deepening the understanding, the knowledge, and the practice of the spiritual exercises in the African context. Let me provide a few examples. One of the benefits of the approach that I'm calling vernacularization, that you might also call adaptation, is that it could enable us to overcome some of the challenges that pose obstacles for modern day users of the spiritual exercises, particularly in a context like ours. For example, the patently masculine and patriarchal language of the exercises, which some women rightly find troubling and upsetting. Several women, like Sister Anne Arabome in her book, Why Do You Trouble This Woman? The Spiritual Exercises of Ignatius and African Women, and Elizabeth Liebert and Anne-Marie Pauline Campbell, here present, in their book, The Spiritual Exercises Reclaimed, they have proposed imaginative approaches and creative adaptations of the spiritual exercises in ways that speak to our present-day context without sacrificing originality for creativity. Which is why I believe, you might argue with this, that the work of these women and several other women represent the best examples of contextualization of the spiritual exercises in African context today. As Liebert and Pauline Campbell state, quote, both the spiritual exercises and their interpretation merit a negative hermeneutic to uncover the complicity with a patriarchal ideology, as well as a positive hermeneutic to uncover the liberating possibilities for women, end quote. Speaking of liberating possibilities for women, Arabome demonstrates how, by applying the gift of imagination, which St. Ignatius of Loyola highly recommended, women encountering the exercises reveal their power to imagine another God possible, a God who does not hold women captive to masculine power and domination and the attendant prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination based on gender. In fact, Arabome observes, quote, what I find particularly refreshing is that it is in the exercising of the gift of my imagination as a woman that I can break the mold of patriarchy, androcentrism, sexism that produces only one limited and alienating image of God. Thus, the fixation on the maleness of God crumbles before the power of my imagination to see the God in whose image and likeness I was fashioned. This is something that happens almost routinely in my prayer. Using their imagination, women are perfectly capable of relativizing and neutralizing the hold of this maleness, end quote. So the work of these women and several other women build what Liebert and Pauline Campbell call, quote, appropriate bridge, an appropriate bridge that women can use to cross fully into the world of the spiritual exercises so that they can see themselves as intrinsically valuable and unconditionally loved by God, end quote. So my point is, as you can see, contextualization is not merely a problem-solving exercise. Far from it. When it comes to the spiritual exercises, this process can open up new paths for creative adaptations and new meanings into its dynamics. If the central experience of the spiritual exercises is a profoundly transformative encounter with the life, the passion, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus, how best to articulate African Christians' experiences and understanding of Jesus from their own context of life, and in dialogue, why not, with the expressions of Jesus in other parts of the world. So imagine a time when, for example, the spiritual exercises might be proposed and experienced as a communal experience in the light of Ubuntu. In other words, in a synodal manner. Or times when the imageries of the exercises will draw from the rich and vibrant universe of African symbolisms and languages, including the faces of Jesus in Africa, the narratives and stories of African cultures, the songs, the dances, the embodied forms of meditation and contemplation, the contextualization of the central symbols and experiences of the spiritual exercises, like election, discernment, consolation, desolation, the two standards, the call of the king, contemplation to attain love. In fact, Chikere Ugwanyi gives practical examples of adaptations of the spiritual exercises in Africa, like using the Rift Valley in Kenya, quote, as a great plain on which the forces of good and evil have contended as the setting for the meditation on the two standards, end quote. My main point is this: if we could do this, imagine how the spiritual exercises could come alive with new energy, illuminating insights and deeper meaning for the women and men of our times in our context and beyond. Why does this all matter? Why does this all matter? Last February, I was privileged to facilitate a Lenten retreat at the invitation of the director of Sophia Institute for Theological Studies and Spiritual Formation, Sister Anne Arabome. Shortly after that retreat, I received the following message from a religious woman who lives in the United States, but is deeply active in the formation of the African members of our religious community. She wrote, quote, "You know, what we need is a book on Ignatian spirituality for the spiritual exercises with an African perspective." I know Anne Arabome wrote something for women, but there's such a huge need. There's such a huge need and a great market for something like your work tailored for African cultures and focused on Ignatian spirituality. I asked another Nigerian Jesuit who was starting a healing center in Nigeria to do something like that. I met him in 2009 in the north of Ireland, but I don't think he went for it. So would you please think about it? It doesn't have to be academic, but accessible. Accessible. End quote. And so to the participants at this symposium on the spiritual exercises in the African context, especially our experts, I repeat the plea of Sister Kathleen Bryant. What we need is a book on Ignatian spirituality for the spiritual exercises with an African perspective. So would you please think about it? May we one day rejoice in having the spiritual exercises brewed in an African pot. May God grant success to the work of our hands during this symposium and beyond. Thank you. I should stay? Okay. To interrogate me. Okay, I see that, sure.
So I have the feeling that some of you are tired of clapping. So can we clap more convincingly? So we thank Bato for this wonderful presentation. When we were thinking about this, and we considered inviting you for this keynote address, someone said, you know, Bato always delivers. Always delivers. And our hope was not disappointed. So we delivered.
Thank you.
So thank you. So I will not take much of the time to. Okay. That's all then. To comment on what was very clearly delivered. We just have about 15 to 20 minutes to address our questions to Bato. And make them short, please, so that we can draw more from his wisdom. And the many more questions we will not be able to answer because of time. We will write them down so that when he goes back and edit his paper for publication, he can integrate your considerations. So your questions are most welcome.
That's a hand there. That's a hand there.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Bato, for your. Let me start so that people can listen clearly to me. For your very insightful presentation dealing with the issue of translation, which is a very, very complicated issue, actually. Even in biblical studies, we have to deal with it, which is actually the meeting of various worlds. The word of the author, the word of the translator, and the word of the reader. So, can you precisely say something? I mean, clearly, you speak to so many things, but can you just make it clear for me the distinction between vernacularization, translation, and contextualization? Is there? I mean, contextualization we can understand, but what is the difference you make between translation, vernacularization?
Thank you.
Simply, in simple words. Thank you.
You're asking a theologian to say something in simple words.
Yes.
But so when I'm speaking of translation, I use the concept of translatability, not as in translating word for word or word from word. I mean a process, a recognition that the reality that is before us can be conveyed in multiple ways. It's not the actual work of translation, it's just recognizing, like I said, translatability. It means that the example I gave of Christianity, it can be translated. How we do it is a different question, which is then we talk about vernacularization. Do we do it in a particular medium that speaks to me and my community? Is it sufficient? You were talking about the biblical translation. In the work that you do, you try to render the meaning of a particular text or word in a way that can be understood for your community of listeners and audience. So there's an element of vernacularization there. When you vernacularize, you don't simply repeat the original language. You use a different medium that speaks more directly to your community of users or audience. But in that process itself, what you're doing, and this is that's why I spend a lot of time on this, you're also contextualizing. You're making it, you're rendering it sensible in this particular context. That is, you are taking into account the times, the places, the peoples that make up this space when you are engaged in that process of vernacularization. So that what you produce is not simply any material that could become, generally available, but that actually speaks to the reality of the users, your community, your audience. That's what I'm talking about. And that's why I insisted that in our case, Father Jose Minaku started off talking about spirituality, not in the abstract. He said, well, look, we are situated in a particular social, cultural, economic, political context. That's where our spirituality comes alive. So if we are contextualizing a material, we're really asking ourselves, does this make sense here, now, in this environment? Or how can it make sense in this environment? So that, not in short, but in a long form, is what I'm trying to convey when I talk about translatability, vernacularization, and contextualization. Thank you.
Thank you, Batter, very much. I certainly endorse your plea for good translations of the exercises into the African context. However, that's one aspect of translation. Every time we give the exercises, we are translating them for the person. So there is already a contextualization happening. So there is another dimension to translation. But what really struck me was the difference. I wonder how you would make the difference between this translatability and assimilation, which is quite a different operation. And there must inevitably be, it seems to me, points of resistance where we look where the message of Christ or Christ himself is resisted by the culture, which are also illuminative moments. So where would you identify those points of resistance? And how would we deal with those?
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you very much, James. Thank you. That's a very important. Okay, sure.
So we take 2 questions and then we proceed with answer.
Okay, thank you. I'm not asking a question. It's just expressing satisfaction at the concept of vernacularization and adaptation, because my question has always been, or my worry with a translation into our context has always been the audience. Because when I take for example, many of us have grown and we have studied not in our languages but in English or in French. And that has influenced also our worldview, our way of seeing things, and our way of relating, such that today many of us, we are almost cut off from our roots, and we don't know so much about our cultures. So when my worry has always been, how does coming back to my culture, that as I see, especially in Cameroon, many children are moving away from their culture. How will that help? But the aspect of adaptation clarifies the question for me, because it simply means not only coming back to our cultures as something perhaps which we no longer understand very well, but how do we understand it in our present society? So I'm happy about it, knowing that translation is just bringing the exercises or whatever is translated to our present way of understanding things and of living our lives. So it's just a thank you.
Thank you, Father. Okay. That's the third one.
Thank you very much for your great presentation. My question is, I depart from contextualization, where you stress on creative adaptation. You highlighted something very important, the feminine approach to the spiritual exercises. This is very important. At the same time, it is a small danger to replace patriarchy by matriarchy. Why not envision a possibility to gather women and men to write something that is fully human balance? This is what I am suggesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, there is another one.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Father Roberto, for your presentation. And actually, Father Joachim here is preempting what I had written here. So the Spirit is working. I appreciate that you have mentioned about the book Spiritual Exercises Reclaimed. I have had an encounter with the first edition. I realized there's a second edition, which Anne-Marie is a co-author. And my question was, how can we use imagination and African symbolism to challenge patriarchal norms in the adaptation of spiritual exercises for African context? Thank you.
Thank you. Get answers from that. We will receive some time. We take more questions, and
Well,
since we are not sure to have time, so start writing them down. Please.
And thank you for all the questions. What I really find exciting about this is that this is precisely what is going to be the theme or the core, the matter of our gathering over the next 3 days, is to engage with these questions. So I don't, for once, pretend that I have the answers to all of these questions. And I hope that even as you're stimulated in raising these questions, we as a collective are able to provide the wisdom and the insights that would help us understand this question. But I was very grateful for the point you made, James, about the translation that happens in the experience itself, that every time we make this experience, there is a level of translation. But that takes a certain level of amount of awareness. That is not automatic, but that we actually, what I'm actually advocating is that awareness that we're actually making that translation as we make this experience. And what does it look like in a context like this? What does it look like? You know, when I made the spiritual exercises as a novice, my spiritual director was a novice man, actually talked about snow and heat. I had never seen snow. I don't know what snow looks like. But he said, think about snow, how you feel when... I have no idea what snow looks like. You know, but I had to, I don't want to say pretend, but I had to sort of enter into that experience, okay, and say what a wonderful, experience I had, imagining heat during snow, and how I felt so warmed by, but it has to be conscious. I think in my experience, it was that idea that, okay, here's the book, and you make it as is in the book. And I did. And I passed. But what you're suggesting is that there are deeper ways of engaging with this experience. And I'm adding the expression awareness, that we're actually conscious that we are trying to do that so that it makes sense for us. But then you talked about assimilation and resistance. What are some of the points of resistance? And I'll speak for myself, okay? I don't make any general statements. In the course of my reflection, I wondered about the possibility a synodal way of making these spiritual exercises, what I call, in light of, in the spirit of Ubuntu, a communal approach. What I struggle with in the spiritual exercises is that it's really steeped in my relationship with God as an individual. It revolves around that. And I don't want to preempt Catherine Wayaki's presentation. I have read your paper. It's fascinating. Because I'll just leave it at that. Okay? But the idea is that there can be a richer, wider context for this. So I struggle with that. That's a point of resistance for me. It's the very strong emphasis on the individual and the individual's relationship with God, which permeates the entire experience. I would benefit more. I think I would gain something if there was a way of opening it up to an experience that is more collective, more communal. And that's the kind of contextualization or translation or vernacularization that I would like to see in the spiritual exercise. Then the second thing, which I also mentioned, this might not be, I don't want to sound like the outsider who weeps louder than the bereaved, but I mentioned the question about gender. I think if we just stick to the text as is and allow for no possibility of adaptation, it can become a point of resistance. I mean, I like the imageries, but sometimes when I encounter the imageries, and I speak in my own gender as a man, as a heterosexual, some of them I struggle with. When I encounter, kings and lords, it triggers something in me. Even when I encounter certain theological languages, it triggers something in me. So I'm advocating for the possibility to retain that intent of Ignatius, but then explore ways of conveying it that actually draws us closer rather than make us resistant. And I think that's work for us all to do. And I want to say again, I'm not the expert here. I look around the room and I can point at people whom I can say, you need to be thinking about this. This is work for you. The second thing, Joseph, he talked about culture, and I like when you say, I think what you were suggesting, the way I understand is that, culture is not, there's a sense in which we think of culture as deterministic. We are products of culture, true, but we also create cultures, which means cultures evolve. They are not static, they are dynamic. And when you talk, the example you gave, for example, when you talked about, what about people who've moved away from their cultures? Well, you could also think about people in our generation who are embracing different kinds of cultures, like digital culture. Again, I won't go into that because I know Folifak is going to tell us all about that in his presentation. Then, the creative adaptation, Father Zundi, replacing patriarchy by matriarchy. No. That's not the point. That's definitely, and I'm speaking as someone who is familiar with some of the work of our colleagues. It's not about replacing one system with another. I mentioned the point that Anne-Marie and her colleague underscored in their book. They talked about a negative and a positive hermeneutic. Recognizing that there is a challenge here, but then identifying ways in which we can overcome this so that it becomes accessible to everyone. So it's not replacing one by the other, it's broadening it. And how we do that means that we have to be willing to listen to the contribution of people who don't share necessarily the worldview or who feel uncomfortable with the worldview that is expressed in the exercises. Thank you very much. And, you said he stole your line. How can we use the imagination to challenge a patriarchy in our adaptation of the spiritual exercises for Africa? I underline the value of imagination, and I have to admit that yes, I was familiar with the use of imagination in the spiritual exercises. Ignatius talks about applying the senses, but it was not until I read the book that I referenced, Sister Anna Rabome's book, Why Do You Trouble This Woman? She has a chapter on the power of the gift of the imagination. That's when I really began to imagine the possibility of what we can do with this material called the spiritual exercises. That is not simply inviting us to apply senses in the sense of just look at the materials there and try to feel that you're in it. Is actually inviting us to go further and farther by actually thinking about how the experience itself can be reimagined in a way that makes sense, that makes it even more alive for users of that material today. So the imagination, again, I want to say I'm not talking about fantasy. It's not about daydreaming. It's work. It's work of the heart, but also work of the spirit when we think about imagination. And I'm sure that
I am Cameroonian by marriage, and I was fascinated when I lived in Cameroon for a very short time, unfortunately, a very short time of my life, by the amount of symbolic expressions. Sometimes you ignore them when they are from your own place, you don't see them. But when you go some other place, you begin to see, for example, the masks, the use of the masks in Western Africa, and how the people cannot see that as a joke. In Mwangaza, they've brought the masks on stage as a kind of performance, but you can see some people are still feeling that there's some spiritual power here, right? Is it necessary really to throw all that out, or can we find a way of, using that connection that we have, that language, whether it's part of the translations that we need to be doing, the drama, the dress, the dance, for the spiritual exercises? I think we need to do that, yeah? Okay. The elder, I was comparing the elder with the guide of the exercises of the spiritual guide of, and it's a person who embraces their reality. And so one of the recommendations I'm making, and I think we are all making together with each other, is that we who guide the exercises need to come to grips with our Africanness as well, our self-awareness of our African connectivity. What we try to do at the beginning here, connecting with our mothers or those people on whose shoulders we stand spiritually in our traditions, because they were not totally lost, is part of finding ourselves. And part of that stands with us when we engage with other people, when we help people do the exercises. I wonder how many of us, African spiritual directors or retreat directors, are aware consciously of our African spirituality and how it interacts with the way we give the exercises. And it is a richness. It's not something to be afraid of or to run away from or to kind of put in the back burner, but to really let it come to our consciousness as a resource, because it has been given to us. God is giving it to us ahead of our. I'll skip that because it's already spoken about. So grounding the spiritual exercises in Africa, as far as I'm concerned, needs, first of all, to affirm, and again, I am asking us to interrogate ourselves, with a bit of sharpness to affirm and validate African identity and roots. And I'm saying that not as a waste of words, but because I have seen even many of our young people, many of our older people, if you talk about anything of our cultures, of our way of approaching God, they think of, being, yes, that laughter, I know that knowing laughter, that we think it's something, it may lead us astray. As I said, the two women in my parish, whatever it is that we are doing, the thing is, we put them out. Alienation, we need to validate this experience and then walk with it. It's a journey of salvation. Find the paths. What are people really looking for when they say they have these spirit husbands who visit them at night? What's going on? I think we need to validate that and not tell them, no, just pray over it, pour holy water and salted water, I don't know what. Work with it and see what's going on. I don't think it is necessarily all bad, and in the resources within that, we will find the path. If we are going to be able to restore their agency, we cannot also alienate them from their experience. It just doesn't work. Huh? In order to revitalize the retreat work, as I keep saying, the director can draw on their own cultural memory, their ancestral models. All of us have ancestors. I don't know whether you've done work with your ancestors, but I think it's critical for you, even for your self-knowledge and self-appropriation in the world of today. I'm trying to say that what some African scholars from America, African-American scholars have called Molefikete Asante, especially talks about Afrocentrism. It is to approve, so to speak, the experience of the African person as a legitimate place where God is acting. God has been here before us, God is here before us, is working with our people, and with their live culture, not just the culture as in the past, but their live culture such as they're experiencing it today. Yeah? And myself as director, whatever you're not conscious of and working with is going to influence your work in ways that you don't know. That we know if it's psychology. So awareness helps you. Deepening an ongoing awareness of your Africanness as a retreat director is going to help us do better and own and appropriate the resources that we have perhaps put on the back burner. I'd like to encourage also reflection on family level. Father has already referred to Catherine's paper on land. Land is a very spiritual thing for African people. Is it coming in your retreats? When the African people are talking about the experience, is it coming through? Last week, the man whose child was killed by the police in South Nyanza was talking about the blood of his son, which is crying out to God. That's an African thinking. Among my people, if blood touches, human blood is poured on the ground, there will be payment. It doesn't matter how Christian you are. What are we doing with that when it comes to the Ignatian retreats? Or it's not coming. I think because that is fundamentally how we feel, And this man was very genuine. He said, this blood is going to cry out. It's not for me to appropriate, but I want to say you need to encourage people to go deeper, because they have spent years and generations being told to ignore and to put away what is African about them. And that may also be yourselves. So we can use African strengths when we are trying to translate the experience. And Jesus says, fear not, by their fruits you shall know them. We have discernment. Let the people learn to be free, not to fear. Because one of the biggest problems we are having is so much fear. So much fear. Is there room for African imagination and artistic forms in Ignatian spiritual exercises and formation? The use of dance, poetry, visual. This is what we are really inviting ourselves, or challenging ourselves to really listen and wake the giant within us. The Ignatius emphasis on the application of the senses, etc. How much can it be African? I like the Rift Valley notion that Father mentioned this morning. Yeah? And I see some dangers in our continuing excuse me, perhaps not all of us are continuing, but sometimes we see most of the Christian life in Africa has tended to ignore that Africanness. And I think when we do that, there are many, many dangers. One of them is because our spiritual hungers as African people are not really being addressed. Our true self may not be welcome around the table of the Christian conversation. When that happens, then that hunger is being attended to in other spaces. And that is why I think our people are so prone to fundamentalism. Somebody will take them off and bring them to a place and tell them to do very crazy things, including all the way to kind of mass suicide. And, you know, because in the proper spaces, we are actually not using these resources or not addressing this. So these pseudo-religious and cultic expressions, we have locked away the resources. I believe that, and I think I have found that when we use our own images, when people can connect with the meaning in their own life, so it's to say, to make the Ignatian exercises, the spiritual exercises, and the African people's experience come into a conversation, an encounter, where there is mutual recognition, there is widening of horizons, and there is greater credibility of the gospel because of this encounter, which respects the depths of our being. That slide repeats the stuff we have already talked about. Yeah, so some of the biggest challenges is accompanying people whom, unless you have a different experience and I'm interested what your experience is, my experience is people are ashamed. Most people on the continent are ashamed of their African roots. As I said, I teach African culture. The young people come into my class, 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, even 30-year-olds. When you talk about African culture being good, you can see they are like, oh my God, where are you taking us? You know, are you taking us in the road of damnation? Just to understand our cultures, they are so afraid. And there is a current culture of suspicion about African ways because also of atrocities. There is a kind of the other danger, which I should have mentioned on this when we're talking about dangers, is some people who feel the alienation of African culture have gone off to a revival of African culture with all manner of external expressions that are interpreted as atrocities. For example, FGM. In central Kenya, we have groups of people who are saying, your women must be circumcised. Somebody has been married 25 years, and then suddenly he wants his wife to undergo FGM because he has returned to his culture. Marriages are breaking because there is a need to be ourselves, but now it's being guided by blind guides. People who go to other extremes because our culture has only been known at the material level. It has not been understood at the deeper levels. So there is need really to recognize that it had depth. It was not just a series of performances. There was some spiritual story going on in there. And it was an authentic story. It was an experience of God. Yeah, so this is the other extreme. So some people will go to fundamentalism. Others are going to extreme fundamentalism of African culture, and it is not also helping them. There are also a lot of young people who feel really the Christian journey has been a lie. The Gen Zs are telling us. They tell us the Christian journey has been a lie. So these are some of the dangers. How are you going to handle that? And I think we also can be dangerous as directors when we are uncomfortable with our Africanness. Because then we bring our hang-ups to the encounter. As we said, the interpretation in the direction of the exercises, we are bringing in our hang-ups. I'm told my time is up. And so in conclusion, I want to say that what we are seeking is maturity of African Christianity. Ignatian spirituality, Ignatian exercises are a wonderful tool for that. I think of maturity as represented by my great-grandmother. She wasn't Christian, but she had a human maturity, very highly refined. That's what we are seeking in our Christians today. And how do you achieve it? It's by engaging without fear, by trusting that our communal processes will lead us to truth, because we have also discernment, which has been part. So the African spirituality helps us to get to depth, and we will not go very far in Africa without African spirituality. And then Ignatian spirituality helps to sharpen and to discern until people find the pathways that are unto life. There are so many horizons, so much needs to be done, so much pain, so much healing, so much corruption. How are we going to create prophetic people unless they are rooted? And Christ is in those roots as well. Thank you. Oh, yeah.
Another after tea round of applause for Idel. Who has really invited us to consider the dialogue between our African spirituality, our worldview, and Ignatian spirituality. Note your questions until we have listened to the other two. And the next speaker is Dr. Feston Kenda. Feston Kenda, SJ, a Tanzanian, is a Jesuit priest and a historian of Africa who currently holds the post of academic director of the Roman Archives of the Society of Jesus. Dr. Kenda has general scholarly interests in matters of identity and nationalism, history of Christianity in Africa, and contextualized theology and spirituality. He has taught history at Hekima University College in Nairobi, Kenya, and Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio, USA, and is currently teaching and directs dissertation on a part-time basis at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. Some of his publications include A Splash of Diamond, the Jesuit province in Ethiopia from 1945 to the present, Rome and Nairobi 2023, The Jesuits East Africa, a historical narrative from Ignatius of Loyola to Pedro Arupe, and the book we were told about today morning, Mazozi ya Kiroho ya Mtakatifu Inyasi wa Inyola in Nairobi 2005, a Kiswahili translation of the spiritual exercises. Karibu, Festo.
I proposed to Dennis that if the PowerPoint doesn't work, it's absolutely fine. We can continue without PowerPoint. So in the meantime, let me begin by expressing my profound gratitude to all of you, in a very special way to the organizers of this conference. I think it's amazing to be able to meet as we do here today and the following days to discuss matters that are really important to us, all of us. It is important to me also to be part of this gathering. As I look around, I see people who first introduced me to the spiritual exercises. And I think that is... Okay. So I see among you people who first introduced me to the spiritual exercises, and that means a lot to me. I also see people with whom we have sat down and discussed some of these things again. And again, that gives me a lot of comfort that we have this opportunity to revisit some of the conversations that we had in the past. And so I would say, without diminishing the importance of this conference, this groundbreaking conference, that really it brings back to mind a conference that was organized in South Africa, in Johannesburg, coordinated by the Jesuit Institute in 2012, of which the topic was spiritual direction in an African context. Again, a huge gathering of people that discussed similar matters, and if I'm not mistaken, the proceedings of that conference were published in a special issue of The Way, the journal The Way. I think it should have come out, I think, in 2013, an extremely important volume of that journal, specifically dedicated to African spirituality, and is the special way the conversations that emanated from the conference in South Africa on spiritual direction in an African context. So I'm extremely happy that, to me at least personally, this has been long in coming. We all wished that a follow-up to the South African experience would have come sooner, but it didn't. I'm happy to see Anne-Marie here. I still have minutes of meetings we had in South Africa figuring out what we might do next. So this, to me, is an important event, an opportunity to do some follow-up on that matter. I think as the day progresses, you will have to get used to repetitions. And so I want to begin by a statement from Father Arturo Sosa when he promulgated the apostolic preferences. As most of us would know, at least the first preference for the Jesuits and their collaborators was, I quote, to show the way to God through the spiritual exercises and discernment, end of quote. As believers, we feel an urgent need to overcome, rather explaining that first preference a little bit more, Arturo wrote again, and I quote, "As believers, we feel an urgent need to overcome both the new secularisms and the nostalgia for cultural expressions of the past. We resolve to collaborate with the Church in experiencing secular society as a sign of the times that affords us the opportunity to renew our presence in the heart of human history," end of quote. To me, this is a commitment primarily to understand the language of new secularisms as well as the cultural expressions of the past so that we can overcome them or renew them with expressions that are more appropriate for our time. Today, we cannot show the way to God through the spiritual exercises using languages and symbols that belong to the past, which no longer build understanding, much less evoke feeling. I still want to quote from the General's letter a little more before I continue further into my presentation. So still in this first preference to show the way to God through the spiritual exercises and discernment, Father Sosa says, and I quote at length here, "The spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola are a privileged instrument for making the life and action of the Lord Jesus present in diverse social contexts of today's world. Therefore, we resolve to gain a deeper experience of the spiritual exercises so that they lead us to a personal and communal encounter with Christ that transforms us. At the same time, we resolve to offer the spiritual exercises in as many ways as possible, providing many people, especially the young, the opportunity to make use of them to begin or to advance in following Christ. Experiencing the spiritual exercises and the spirituality derived from them is our preferred way of showing the pathway to God through commitment to the redemptive mission of Jesus Christ in history. And for me, I think every time we say in history, we may as well say in context. It becomes clear that in order to show the way to God through the spiritual exercises, we must offer the spiritual exercises in as many ways as possible, providing many people, especially the young, the opportunity to make use of them. It seems to me that the variety of persons situated in new and varied contexts or histories dictate the many ways in which we must offer the spiritual exercises. Based on what I was asked to do, I decided to give my presentation the title, The Role of Languages and Translations in Promoting the Spiritual Exercises in Africa. To be honest, I'm not even sure whether by languages and translations I mean two different things. I think probably they mean the same thing, or probably one merges into the other continuously. And so I avoid my own frustration by thinking that way, that languages eventually merge into translations, and translations eventually become languages. I first encountered the spiritual exercises as a Jesuit novice through the remarkably accessible English translation by Louis J. Poole. Today, this translation remains my favorite for my own retreat every year when I engage with the spiritual exercises sapientially, as it were. However, later on, I discovered other English translations, especially the one by George Gans, which has been referred to this morning. Gans' translation is far more technical, and it is enriched with notes that are intellectually stimulating. It remains my preferred translation when I'm engaging intellectually with the spiritual exercises. Yet, I have come to appreciate that a much older translation that was done at the beginning of the last century by Elder Mullen is probably closer or more faithful to the autographed text of the spiritual exercises than the more recent translations that I like. And so I love all these translations for all kinds of reasons, and they serve me for different purposes. I think I could keep on prolonging the list of these English translations as examples. It should be enough now to say that these and many others are not merely different English translations. Each one of them employs a different language, specifically because it targets a different readership, and it seems to me for a very different reason. And therefore, I think we would be poorly served if we just had one English translation of the spiritual exercises. Unless we think that the problem is probably with English, I must say how happy I was to know that we will have Father Jose Garcia de Castro among us in this gathering. He and Father Santiago published a monumental new study of the autograph text of the spiritual exercises, with most of the content in English and Spanish, and most importantly, with hundreds of explanations in notes. With the addition, therefore, we can say that even today's Spanish readers are better served by a new work on the spiritual exercises. What this means is that it would be completely useless, or partially useless, I should say, to try and simply reprint the text of the manuscript and expect that you are serving Spanish readers or Spanish users of the spiritual exercises. Even they need new work constantly done on the spiritual exercises, on the translations of the spiritual exercises. And so, while fresh studies and translations of the spiritual exercises continue to be needed all around the world, I think we can agree that those of us in Africa, those rooted in an African context, those of us who do the spiritual exercises in Africa, or those of us who seek to give the exercises to others in Africa, this need is humongous. It is urgent. We need it more than almost everyone else around the world. If I were to use a political language, I would propose that on this matter of translations and new studies on the spiritual exercises, specifically meant for Africa, on this matter we are supposed to be running when others are walking. We are genuinely behind. The trouble, again, is that it's probably not the first time we are hearing this. It has taken that almost 15 years, no, 13 years to revisit the great experience we had in South Africa. I really hope it will not take that long. And I appreciate again the insistence, the persistence, the begging that Bato did this morning, that do something. I know people are gifted. I know people are doing something. We need to do more. We need to do more. I say we have known our predicament for a long time because I read from Pedro Arrupe in the 1970s saying, I quote, "I also believe it to be indispensable that the Jesuits of Africa and Madagascar should be formed to live generously according to the spirit of the society and to have a profound knowledge of the spiritual exercises, not only to live the exercises, but also to be able to give them." He then adds this important emphasis, and I quote again, "I also think it would be useful for you to compare notes also about how to give and direct the spiritual exercises." End of quote. This was directed to Jesuits in Africa. What Arrupe was pointing at was not expertise on notes imported from elsewhere, but notes put together specifically for giving and directing the spiritual exercises in Africa. By necessity, such notes would have to use languages that make sense to the various targeted African contexts. Besides Arupe, the 32nd General Congregation, which met from 1974 to early 1975, spoke about the spiritual exercises in a manner relevant to Africa then and today. In its most recognized Decree 4, the congregation said, and I quote, "The ministry of the spiritual exercises is of particular importance in this regard," and the regard is inculturation. A key element in the pedagogy of the exercises is that its aim is to remove the barriers between God and the human person, so that the Spirit speaks directly with the person. Inherent in this Ignatian practice of spiritual direction is a deep respect for the exercitant as he or she is, and for the culture, background, and tradition that have gone into making him or her what he or she is. Moreover, the pedagogy of the exercises is a pedagogy of discernment. It teaches the person to discover for himself or herself where God is calling him or her, what God wants him or her to do, as he or she is, where he or she is, among his or her own people. End of quote. We can take at least 3 points, I think, from this important text of the General Congregation. First, that the spiritual exercises are a tool for inculturation. Second, that the spiritual exercises themselves must be inculturated, for that is the only way there can be deep respect for the culture, background, and tradition of others. And third, that the spiritual exercises must help the one making them discover a language through which he or she begins to hear God speak to him or her in his or her own language, and also a language by which he or she can accurately describe his or her own personal encounter with God, both in prayer and in life experiences. We shall surely be bad givers and directors of the exercises if we constantly invite our retreatants first to learn our own language before we can give them the spiritual exercises. The opposite should actually be the practice, that if we are to be of any help at all as givers and directors, we must first spend time learning the language of those we wish to help, lest we fail to render them the respect they deserve and end up adding barriers between God and the human person, rather than reducing or completely eliminating those barriers. I would like to spend the few remaining moments I have to give 3 reasons why I think translating the spiritual exercises is so important and urgent in Africa today. The first reason is that we need to make the spiritual exercises accessible to the different people we serve in their own languages. Thankfully, and again, as Bato told us in the morning, some work has been done in this regard. We have translations, at least printed and circulated, four, that of in Malagasy, that in Kiswahili, that one in Chinyarwanda, and I think there's something in Chishona. And Lingala, printed and circulated. Okay, excellent, excellent. So I'm glad to know that we are talking of 5. So this is important. So we are not starting from 0. But I must say, after so many years of this conversation, this is not good enough. This is really not good enough, and a lot more need to be done. We cannot say that the 5 that we have are like a good representation of what could be done across the continent of Africa. I do not see how, for example, one can use French to direct the spiritual exercises in Madagascar without opting knowingly to only serve a certain category of people, even a certain class of people. I could say exactly the same thing about my own country, Tanzania. I don't see how you can choose English as your medium for the exercises without excluding the majority of people who could benefit from this important service that we can give. I could say the same thing about Ethiopia. I don't see how you can use English in Ethiopia. Of course, you will get clients. You will get a few people who are like us, who know our language. So you wouldn't have to take the trouble of learning these other people's languages so that you serve them. You would be comfortable serving only those who can speak your language. And I think if we do that, we are not doing Africa a service. We are not. We are creating categories of people and actually choosing the uppermost class and choose to serve it, excluding the vast majority of Africans. My second reason for insisting on translations in Africa is the need to make the language of the spiritual exercises context specific. And what I mean here is that even the English and French translations don't serve us. They don't. They may help here and there, but honestly speaking, they don't. They don't. They were not written for the African context. I think of the many examples of issues that are supposed to be addressed by our language, the issues that Dr. Churu raised just before me. That was not the audience of whoever translated Pools or Guns or any of those translations. So we need to produce translations that are context specific. If I may give an example of East Africa, I do not think it is enough to have one Kiswahili translation and hope that it will serve the whole region equally either. I imagine a need to have a translation that suits Nairobians, for example. As I say this, I remember a story. There's a journalist, a regular contributor to The Nations, Philip Ochieng, who used to have a column that was quite entertaining. And in one of his columns, he wrote in exceptionally good English. And in one of the columns, he was really lambasting Kenyan youth, that they cannot speak in any one language consistently. They speak in multiple languages, and yet they pretend that they know a lot. What Ochieng never imagined is that neither the Luo, which he spoke, nor English, which he spoke extremely well, nor Kiswahili, which he also spoke well, none of them individually, singly, served the world that the youth inhabited. They needed to choose and select from all the three languages and probably even add new vocabularies just to speak to their own world. And so what I'm imagining here is that if our target is the youth of Nairobi, we are not going to invite them to learn like Queen's English. Otherwise, they cannot be given the spiritual exercises. We'll have to work out translations. We'll have to use their language. Otherwise, we will lose them. My third and last reason is that we need to learn from Ignatius himself. If I may regret for not showing you the slides, is that I wanted to show a page from Ignatius's spiritual diary. And what I want to say is that he, as the author of the exercises we celebrate, I think he kept on editing his notes like throughout his life. Why? Because he found better expressions. He found new ways of saying what he said yesterday. And probably if he lived up to today, he would have continued to do that forever. He would be completely shocked that if we think his last text, in whatever version we have it, was the last version. Definitely, he had the intent, at least, of continuing to revise it. The page I was going to show you from the spiritual diary was even about his own spiritual experience. And it's full of, I think the number of cancelled words is just as much as that of the words that survived his pen. So he wrote, and then he thought better of it and cancelled and wrote it again, or felt that, no, this expression is not the correct one, I need to use this one. And so the work of editing continued. Who are we not to continue from where he left? And in this sense that even if I were to do my Kiswahili translation today, I am sure there's a lot that I would do differently. Why? Because we learn new things. We get new insights. And all these have to feed into the continuous translation of the spiritual exercises. I think we must update our translations constantly for those reasons. I think if we don't do that, we run a major risk of actually killing the spiritual exercises themselves. It is said that people who preserve their own culture, like from being diluted by modernities and things like that, by new language, like Sheng from Nairobi, those who do that, societies that have done that, eventually go to extinction. To survive, to thrive, and to continue to exist means to continue changing. If we don't keep on translating the spiritual exercises into specific contexts, we will render them into a museum or an archive relic that only a few curious people will come to look at and go home. Thank you very much.
So, brothers and sisters, let me present my gratitude to JCAM, Father Jose Minaku, the president, and to the Jesuit Historical Institute and all the organizers, Father Joseph and Father Jean-Luc, to invite me to join this event, even if I'm working now in a French-speaking country. you understand what I mean. So I will read my paper, and then I will stop when Catherine will ask me to, as the paper will be available at the end. And I'm invited to reflect on the African theological dimensions of the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola. I did not reformulate the topic, although I would have preferred to talk more specifically about Afro-African spirituality rather than African theology. And Father José said that spirituality and theology should go united. The theme, African theological dimensions of the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, suggests a fruitful connection between African theology and the theology of the spiritual exercises. This necessitates an African interpretation of the exercises and highlights dimensions of African theology that can engage meaningfully with the spiritual exercises, allowing the African continent to benefit from this dialogue. My approach will be revolves around three axes. The first is a reminder of the theology of the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. The second is the identify the relevant dimensions of African theology, and the last will explore the vital and fruitful link between these themes of African theology and Ignatian spirituality. The first point, the theology of the spiritual exercises. Do the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius have a specific theology? In my opinion, it is not necessary to ascribe to this work of Christian spirituality a theology that distinguishes it from Western Catholic Christianity. Trained in the robust theology of the Sorbonne, Paris, of his time, Ignatius warned against any opposition between the theology of the Church Fathers and that of the scholastics. From then on, the theology of the exercises is that of the Catholic Christian faith. It is the theology of God's salvation in Jesus Christ. We can summarize these central truths. The God who loved created everything. After many contacts with humankind, he revealed himself definitively to mankind in the person of Jesus. He saves mankind from sins and its harmful consequences, disordered attachment. In fact, Jesus Christ offers divine filiation and opens us up to the mystery of the kingdom of God. In other words, in the Christian faith, we discover the face of the invisible God in Jesus Christ, the incarnate Son of God. From this revelation, we learn that God is Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. With the four-step dynamic, the exercises govern this theology. The principle and foundation reminds us that God created, and its logical consequences, man is created free, and everything on the face of the earth has been created by God for man. The first week allows us to meditate on the acts of redemption in Jesus Christ, despite the sin that entered history and was aiding for destruction. The triune God decided on the redemption and the salvation of the human race through the incarnation, life, death, and resurrection of the Son of God. The second and the third weeks allow us to contemplate the life of the Redeemer and the way in which he accomplishes his mission in this world. In the second week, we contemplate Jesus going everywhere to do good and restore man to his dignity as the image of God. Jesus feeds, heals, comforts, reconciles, and resurrects. And in the third week, with the mystery of the Passion and the cross, confirming his teaching, Jesus shows us how far love should go. The fourth week rekindles hope by contemplating the mystery of the resurrection, where life and love triumph over death and hatred. It is always the living Jesus who launches out into a ministry of consolation, as started in the fifth point of the first contemplation. Finally, the dynamic leads to the contemplation to attain love. This kind of Pentecost invites us to the concrete experience of God of love in daily life, which opens itself up to the retreatant so that he or she may henceforth live to love and serve his divine majesty. There is no doubt that the exercises with this theology can well enter in fruitful dialogue with African theology, or at least with some of its dimensions, in order to help the African to effectively enjoy the integral salvation that Jesus brought to all humanity. It is now necessary to indicate those elements of African theology that will facilitate this rapprochement. The second point, African theology, some relevant dimensions. African theology has several dimensions. I bring out two of them that are implicitly found in the exercises and that could facilitate a dialogue with the theology of the exercises. They are relevant in the light of the continent's current urgent needs. These are liberation and integral development, or simply the transformation of the social reality. Speaking specifically of the liberation of Africa, Alexandre Bazier notes that, quote, in Africa, the word liberation resonates as a consensual and unifying paradigm, a motto capable of bringing people together. Depending on history, it has served the cause of people in the face of painful events of slavery, colonization, or apartheid. It still serves today as a desire to be fully oneself and to be recognized in one's dignity. Africa seeks its liberation. Africans aspire to liberation, and the exercises advocate liberation. In fact, Africa desires that its salvation, so that it may be total, also help it to begin own development. This is the second significant dimension of African theology today, development. For the Ignatian spirituality or Ignatian exercises to be more relevant in Africa, they must imperatively meet African theology and dialogue on its liberation and salvation and also development. The third point, liberation and development. Two African theological dimensions of spiritual exercises. It is in its very first decree regarding the Jesuits and their mission of reconciliation and justice, the Society of Jesus poses this provoking question. I quote, "Why do the exercises not change us as profoundly as we might hope? What are the elements of our life, our works, or our way of life that hinder our capacity to let God's mercy transform us? Even if the spiritual exercises do indeed transform those who approach them with sincerity and firmness, this question implies that we expect even more from the experience of encountering God in Jesus Christ. We hope from them a profound spiritual renewal that will liberate us and inspire our commitment to the liberation, development, and integral salvation of the peoples of Africa." The spiritual exercises and African liberation. Right from the beginning of his little booklet, Master Ignatius informed us about the scope and purpose of these texts and the spiritual experience that it aims to provoke. He says, "Spiritual exercises to overcome oneself and to order oneself life without reaching a decision through some disordered affection." This affirmation directs the entire approach of the exercises towards a self-liberation and a liberation. That is to say, to overcome oneself from deadly bonds in order to decide to take from now on freely and resolutely personal destiny into one's hand. There is the very purpose of the exercises, to free oneself and to decide. It is the freedom that God gives, but also the freedom to acquire and even to conquer. Although the term liberation is statistically absent from the exercises, we can already recognize that it is a central theme in the process of the spiritual exercises. In the depths of this liberation in theology, we will speak of the salvation of God in Jesus Christ. It is to freedom that the retreatant is called in the principle and foundation, a freedom that will be exercised as free will in the relationship between a means and end during the exercises. The same freedom gained through God's forgiveness, liberation, will be applied at the heart of the exercises in the process of decision-making that we refer to as election or fundamental option. Finally, at the end of the experience, in contemplation to attain love, the exercises freely offers himself with all his freedom to the very one who liberates and gives whole. Liberation is also a central theme in African theology. It is a fundamental dimension that cannot be emphasized enough, especially when considering the progress or the development of the continents. Africa remains the weakling. Despite the centuries that have passed since its traumatic historical events, Africa still bears heavy scars. Africans continue to be burdened by many kinds of servitudes. Moreover, it is striking to observe that Christianity, which shapes Europe, seems to be transforming African individual and the social reality only slowly. This is why some people believe that the liberation of black people would contribute significantly to liberate and develop Africa. However, it is important to ask which kind of liberation are we talking about and what is the liberation that Africa needs. From what and from whom must the black man liberate himself and be liberated? The liberation that the Africa needs must be holistic. Some scholars, such as John English, rightly think that it is the deep and the true liberation that God can give, and which includes well-being, personal identity, and peace. In short, is plain. The freedom I'm speaking about is a kind of realized existential freedom. The freedom with oneself and the freedom within oneself. It may be called ultimate freedom, the freedom that accompanies deep awareness of the ultimate meaning of one's life. In the African context, some fathers of African theology of liberation had already oriented the debate in this sense of a global liberation that implies anthropological dimension, the social, political, and economic dimension, and the ethic and the spiritual dimension. I don't know if I have time. I want to jump.
You have 9 minutes.
So I will jump. I will go to the last point. The spiritual exercises and the commitment to the development of Africa. An inspiring dimension in Africa today is the development of construction of a society that is habitable by all. While Africa is often respectfully presented as a developing continent, it is in fact a continent in the grip of crisis. Inspired by the experience of the spiritual exercises, we suggest as a possible solution the promotion of the theology of commitment for the transformation of the social reality through love. In this dialogue with the exercises, we can develop Africa. Spiritual exercises as a pedagogy of love for the transformation of the social reality. The experience of spiritual exercises leads to the contemplation to attain love. Beyond the debate on the place and the importance of this Ignatian peace, we believe that it constitutes the very key to the theological reading of the exercises and the foundation of the entire commitment that can result from it. And such as the contemplation to attain love should leave its mark on the experience of the one life that must characterize the exercises at the end of the retreat. A life marked by a new way of inhabiting the earth, of being and running the paths of life. In Catholic theology, we know that love is the very identity of God. Also, to speak of love is to touch the essence of Christianity. Indeed, the purest love, charity in itself, is on the one hand what formally constitutes the divine essence, and on the other hand, what explains and causes the operations of Lord ad extra. Therefore, any theology and analogy, Christian love refers to God himself, as the author of the letter of John tells us. God is love. The dynamic of the exercises will have allowed the retreatant to grasp the necessary encounter between love, vertical relationship with God, and its horizontal dimension of love of others in the universalist aim. Like God, because of his love, and by love of God, the relationship that exists between the retreatant and his God opens to the relationship of love towards others. The poles are three: God, me, and others, or the others who is another me. Like this divine way of loving, the practitioner is invited to love God and others as God loves, and for this love of God poured into our hearts. Therefore, we love God because He gave us His Son. We love man because the Son gave Himself for them and remains in them. In responding to the love of the Father with the love of the brothers, we participate in the divine life, which is love. From this point, we can conclude that the spiritual exercises are fundamentally an experience of love. The love that is God and the love that sends the retreatant of the fourth week to lead an existence to lead his existence to the love that he will have experienced it as a privileged recipient. This love has become in his response invitation to love through works. In other words, the life of the person who has passed through the exercises becomes a continual recognition and an act of love toward God and neighbors. This is to say that, according to the Ignatian vocabulary, from this end and this threshold, the exercitant would no longer want to do anything but seek and find God in all things, and in all things love and serve His divine majesty. The last point, the spiritual exercises and the development of Africa. In agreement with Professor Nathanael Soede, let us say that the legitimate and relevant approach of a Christian African spirituality today consists in putting spirituality in dialogue with the gospel of kingdom. Such a dialogue will make African spirituality discover that it is a factor in the integral development and total salvation of African peoples. However, we must ask ourselves, how can we find in the spiritual exercises a catalyst for the integral development and the integral salvation of African people? As we have said, through the experience of the exercises, we are imbued with the style of Jesus Christ, his feelings, his choices, in short, with the love of God for the human race, manifested throughout his life until the supreme gift and the resurrection. The person who experiences this love of God, who gives and gives himself, will invite himself to the logic of God and its reciprocity as a sign of his gratitude to God. Because love calls for love, love is reciprocity, and love loves by acting. The man loved and molded by the love of God, conscious of the requirement of recognition and the reciprocity of love, certainly returns to the occupation of daily life, but from now on, writes Hervé Catalan, he will be battered in the light of the final exercises. He will resume his place as before, but in the attitude of orders, illuminated, stimulated, and purified charity. In a word, that is increasingly losing the sense of God and the sense of human happiness, the Christian, in this case, the retreatant, should seek to be more deeply united with Christ in the mysteries of his life, to bear witness to the love. Finally, it can never be stressed enough that faith in Jesus Christ must imprint a lifestyle, a mission, and a task involve the world person for the integral good of mankind and for the development of the city. Conclusion. We sought to highlight some African theological dimensions of the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola, hoping that this connection might inspire the praxis of the exercises in Africa. Our goal is for them to truly become a pastoral tool that encourage Christians to imitate Jesus Christ and to transform their social reality, thereby to develop the continent. Because we believe if the exercises change us carefully, we will change the social reality of Africa. We believe that the retreatant, in this case, in the African context, who has had the profound experience of total liberation in Jesus Christ and has left loved by God, will love God and neighbors according to the very logic of reciprocity of love. And we have also demonstrated that such a love, which is more in works than in words, will fill social reality with a love that changes personal and social life. For the love that wants to be Christians of God and imitation of Christ must have as its necessary expression and final criterion concrete works more than words. Since when God decided to love the world, he loved it by works. In the Christian love, every feeling of compassion is called upon to translate itself into acts in which the relationship established escape the risk of procrastination, the evanescence of feelings alone, or the dangerous uncertainties of inclinations. Finally, we believe that the desired connection between African theology and the spiritual exercises will be fruitful to the extent that on the one hand, the preacher and the facilitator of the Ignatian retreats and the spiritual exercises will present them with contextual elements of African theology and spirituality. On the other hand, the retreatant in African context will approach the experience with the question, what must I do for and with Christ to ensure that Africa is liberated and that love and service become our way of being Christian in Africa? Alternatively, what must I do to develop our society and transform our social reality? Thank you for your patience.
Thank you. No, I'm not releasing you. Another round of applause for Dr. I said I'm not releasing you because it's time for questions. So I'll invite Dr. Churu and Dr. Kenda to come forward, and the team who's managing the online transmission will guide us on how to go about this. Questions? 1, 2.
Thank you.
Please say who you're directing the question to.
Of course, yes. So my question are addressed to the three presenters. The first one should be to Edel Shuru. Thank you for your presentation and trying to make a connection between African spirituality and Ignatian spirituality. One of the characteristics of Ignatian spirituality is its individualistic feature, character. Yes. And the African spirituality we can see also is first of all communitarian. So how can we match those two aspects? And then you say in your presentation was also said that you are ICLC, I think, said leader, Christian, live Christian community. And how do you, in your community, do this Africanization of spiritual exercise, of spiritual Ignatian spirituality in your community? To Kenda, yes, you are the author of, I think, spiritual exercise in Israel, if I don't mistake. Yes. So how do you personally deal with this issue of contextualization? As I think Bata was saying this morning, that some of the aspects of spiritual exercise in the original text are very strange and very difficult to cope with. How did you deal with this issue of contextualization? So, and finally, Malulu, thank you for your insightful presentation also, especially with the issue of liberation, yes, and the spiritual exercise. And I just think that the whole of the spiritual exercise is about getting liberated. You are right. And I wish in my view, you only focus on the meditation to attain love. Yes, you focus finally on it as the aspect of the spiritual exercise we need to develop. Whereas I think that there are many other aspects, liberating aspects in the spiritual exercise. Let me just mention a few of them. For instance, the social dimension of sin. For instance, the issue of corruption, of sin in the first week. Even the two standards, there are many liberating aspects there. The issue of the two powers in our various African countries. Even the meditation of incarnation. I mean, how can African context be viewed in a liberating way? Even the issue of liberation. The discernment also. In 2005, when I was at Ekima, we published a book, and the author of the book is Dynamic of the Spiritual Exercises, African Perspective. The author, we're a group of scholastics after a seminar. We decided to gather our contribution and publishing the books. And some of those aspects were treated in the book, especially my essay in that book was about the spiritual exercise and the liberation aspects. Exactly. Thank you.
Let me take questions from two others, and then you can respond.
Okay, thank you. I'm expressing difficulty. I'm addressing my difficulty to Father Festo Kenda. Africa is multicultural and multilingual. If I take the example of Cameroon alone, we have more than 250 languages, 250 ethnic groups. And none of these languages is an academical language. And in our big towns, we have a mixture of these cultures and languages. So, and we use English and French, at times Pidgin. It's only the Bible that is translated into local languages and is used only in the liturgy. So nobody reads the local languages out of the liturgy. So if we are to translate the exercises into these languages, who will read them? So that's why I feel that in our context, perhaps adaptation and contextualization is more appropriate than translating, which may not serve the purpose or serve any useful purpose. That's just an observation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Churu for reminding me of my own experience of my mother as a Jesuit, training me in Ignatian spirituality. So 14 years ago, I was right here preparing for my ordination, and I was having my retreat here, writing my little biography for the ordination brochure. So I think exactly in the same room where I was staying now, and I wrote in my note during my prayer, but my mother is a Jesuit, training me in Ignatian spirituality before I knew who the Jesuits were. And I felt like it was too presumptuous, or maybe it was too much. So thank you for reminding me and helping me to own more that experience of myself. And as I listen to your presentation, I think the question is no longer how can we? Because we are witnesses of it. And I heard it in your presentation. We are witnesses of how it has been possible to apply or experience Ignatian spirituality in African context and worldview. So my question is, what is the universality of the African culture and experience? The way the so-called Western ideas are being universalized. And we have experienced them as true. Some of the things from the Western approach are true for all human beings. So what is the universality of the African context, the African experience, the African spirituality? Is it something that someone from another culture can also experience and find it to be true in God? Is it something we want to develop just for Africans? But because Ignatius was not intending only for the Spanish or for the Europeans when he was writing the exercises. So from Dr. Churu's presentation is that question of owning myself. And together with Farabato's presentation of vernacularization is to speak from my own culture, not translating. So the universality of this African experience that we are talking about. And from all the presenters so far, I've not heard anyone mention something about silence. What is the place of silence in African spirituality, African culture? The challenge, especially with everybody. People will say the silence is too much. So what do we do with that? And finally, the GC34, if I'm not mistaken, asked a very important question. Why has the spiritual exercises not changed us, not transformed us as much as we will want? Could the problem include the obstacle of presented by language, by contextualization, by vernacularization, and inculturation? Either lack of it or otherwise. So why has it not transformed us? Or is it possible that we have done a lot of academic work on it, rather than testifying to the fact that it is happening, the integration is happening, rather than testifying to it? We keep questioning it to give more testimony to what is already happening. Because all of us here have experienced exercises. We are Africans. what has it done for me? What has it done to us? To bear witness to it more than to question it. Thank you.
Go ahead. I will make a little attempt to respond to the questions addressed to me. I do not expect to be able to address all of them. Nevertheless, I think this individualistic communitarian balance comes in through sharing the experience in an ongoing way rather than in a sporadic way, right? I think the Western approach, at least to which we have been introduced, is predominantly a personal journey, whereas we can skew the balance so that the personal journey has many more occasions for communal engagement. In addition, to engage on critical matters, rather than just on the, so for example, when people have families, like my two matriarchs, I engaged with them in family-related matters. So it's automatically it is communitarian. So when you engage in mission, when you engage in day-to-day things and share at the spiritual level, it becomes more communitarian. But also, how do we communicate what we have experienced? I remember when we talk about translation, I remember giving the exercises in the open door retreats in South Africa a few years back, a good while back. And we were using, obviously, the English language translations such as we have them. But what I regret is that we did not collect the sharing in one way or another, or at least keep a record of what the people's experience was coming through. Yeah? And I think that would contribute a little bit to what you are saying, Ignatius writing over his experience and articulating the meanings. So I think we need also to take care more of what we share as heritage to pass on to next generations. After all, we come from experience and then we write and then we pass on. And I think we need to share that in many different kinds of media because our people are not just in the literate media. And languages are deficient in communicating our shared meanings. They actually are quite deficient. So I want to draw attention to the fact that I think even in Ignatius' time already in Europe, there was a tendency, of course, it's coming towards the Council of Trent, the defending that we are saying exactly what we mean and fixing ourselves within language boundaries. And then by the time we have most of Christianity coming to Africa, the rest of it is after the Enlightenment, where there is a very great fixation with exactness using literal language, if you like. And that also has impoverished what we have received. And I think we have to be able to recapture that through the people making the exercises, because after all, it is a gift of the Spirit, and then be able to keep those records in different media. Now, CLC in Africa, I do not think we have done very well in terms of Africanization. The best piece where we have helped ourselves is that because we meet in groups and discuss, the oral medium is very strong. But I think we suffer the same as most of African Christians, the fear of our Africanness, at least at depth. So I think we are not exempt from that, and very few of us are willing to move. Especially with a lot of respect, I want to say that theologians and and most of the people with the teaching faculties in the church have not steered a path that shows that it is okay. And so most lay people would not dare go that path. That's my personal perception. We do a little bit, our sharing in communities is a little bit, but I don't think there is enough of steering the path of opening, showing the glory, the goodness in our cultural richness. The question about universality of African culture. Actually, it's interesting. When I was writing my paper, I am still writing my paper, I found that most of what I am saying would apply to very many other cultures, right? Many friends I have in Europe, in the simple communities, they are not very happy about everything coming through in one kind of monolithic language across the world. That was one of my big surprise to discover that they are trying to protect their culture, and I thought all Western people are in the same culture. They are not. People want to, to rediscover their communities, and to preserve what is precious among them. Of course, most of the native cultures are very close to nature, and they have a lot to teach us, and they are across the world. So again, I want to say it is more the experience than the theories. And that as we share, we enrich each other, and we need to share in more than just the written word. Perhaps we need to preserve some of the materials and some of the exercises, the experience of the exercises in other media. Silence. I think when we impose silence, we need to think how we are imposing it. Again, we may be imposing it in measures that are not exactly manageable or meaningful to people. Most of the African people, in my experience, are highly introverted, actually. They like their space, they like to do their own thinking. So we have to think also creatively how we can teach people the value of silence. Because the predominant market culture is driving them to think the thoughts that serve the market economy, right? And so all the time they are being pulled out of themselves, attention within themselves. But if we creatively, for example, I have found very, very meaningful helping young people to go into silence using various methods of meditation. They always find it very, very helpful. But perhaps you have to do that with smaller measures. Perhaps you have to, and then help them to diarize in a sitting, which they begin to experience the value. I think, again, the ball is in our court. We have to think creatively, but I think it is something that people actually value. Yeah. So our main occupation is to fit in the way of the world. I write this because the question has been asked several times this morning about why is it the exercises have not quite transformed us as much as they have the potential to do so. And I would say that also about Christianity as such on the continent. Most of the people that lead, let me talk for Kenya, most of the people that have been in leadership in Kenya have been graduates of Christian schools. And you can see how our country has spiraled, and we are down to the dregs. But I think the problem is, again, the volume at which, let me say this, the call of the king, with the ancient imagery such as it is very clear, but I think we are talking about, there is a very strong voice of following the way of the world, especially money, having a lot of money. And my experience even with education, which has been a big piece of my concern, is that when we are educating, we want to fit with the model of the schools that are making the money. We want to fit with the model of, so the drive is more in terms of the world converting us to its way than we converting the world to the way of the gospel. And I just put that to us, and I find that the call of the king, if you like, the choice between this path and this path, I think we treat it a little bit with like, it's just for the exercises. It's not really serious for life, is it really? Because we are so attracted by the mammon, if you like, and we want to fit the mold. So I guess it's a personal question, but it's also a community question. Where do we want to fit? And how can we make it really more attractive for young people, for example, to collaborate with each other and support each other? For example, there's a question here, somebody stole their way, Catherine, if you allow me, by writing a question that didn't come through the mic. But the question being that how can we protect spirituality, connect spirituality to our physical, mental, and financial growth? First of all, what do we mean, for example, by financial growth? Because frequently what we mean by financial growth, and indulge me a little bit, it is a way in which I am way, way, way ahead and richer than all the others, and people are, so should I stop? Okay, that's thank you. So, the point is to clarify, and once we clarify what it is we are looking for, work to, I think in our subconscious spiritual communication, all these levels come into play. So, sorry to leave it kind of hanging.
I am now having to be a nasty moderator because I will not let the two of you answer the questions. I will encourage you to engage them anytime after we part for lunch. I'm sure they will be happy to answer the questions. And whatever questions they were, we are hoping that they will somehow be integrated in your final paper. Thank you.
So thank you for those following online. We will continue tomorrow at 9 a.m. Thank you for being with us and for following us.